I've been talking about reviewing some Beatles solo material, and before I do that, I wanted to get this video out of the way first. Now, I've gotten the ball rolling with my colleague John Heaton. He and I have reviewed 3 different Beatles solo albums so far, and we've got another one to do, and I've been putting John off because I want to get this video done. This is a wide view of the Beatles solo careers that I wanted to take a peek at. And the reason I wanted to do it is because I think there's some much needed perspective on the Beatles solo careers. One thing I've noticed a lot is that a lot of Beatle fans, they tend to take the brilliance of the Beatles and all that success and fame and critical acclaim they had and put that onto the Beatles solo careers and treat the Beatles solo work all through up to the current day almost as something equal. And it is not equal. And I think people forget that those solo guys were just 1/4 of a once great band. And there was a time when those guys were no longer on the cutting edge. And it does coincide pretty much when they broke up. And I want to first start talking about, just want to talk about the breakup briefly and what the timing of it, because I think they broke up at about the right time. I mean, I could see them maybe going another 12 months, release an album or two. And I think that if they could have broke up amicably, that would have been a great gift to give to the fans, because I think they could have rose to the occasion. But we're going to look at what was coming out at the time they broke up, and I think it's very plain to see that very quickly the torch got passed. I just want to show you how I view the Beatles solo eras, because there's really about 3 different eras. Let's have a look at these here. So the eras I'm breaking this into, the first one is called the Golden Era, which is 1970 to 1982. This covers 12 years from the breakup of the Beatles to the album that was recorded just after John Lennon's death. It's roughly 1982. The next era, which I call the era of chart decline, this was in the wake of John Lennon's death. This was 1983 to 1994. This is also a 12-year period. Then we had a brief pause in 1995 and 1996 for the Anthology Project. That was 2 years. So up to now, this is a total of 26 years from 1970 to 1996. And it's followed by the Twilight Era, which is another 26 years, which is 1997 to the present. So let's see what the Beatles were up to during this time. And in 1970, we've got 5 albums by the ex-Beatles. We have the first one here that I've listed is John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band. Definitely a cutting-edge album. It was critically acclaimed at the time, it stood the test of time, and was very popular. George Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a very huge success. Although it's maybe not dated as well for its time, I would say it was very much on the cutting edge. As a singer-songwriter, instrumentalist, kind of the big ensemble cast, like the old movies, you used to get all the players from the whole studio. This was almost like what George did, surrounded by friends. McCartney's first album, I wouldn't say track for track it's that good, but the whole idea of the do-it-yourself album, that was to become a bigger thing in the 70s. And then we have 2 Ringo albums where he's doing cover songs, not on the cutting edge. Let's see what the competition was turning out in 1970. Let's see here, we got Led Zeppelin 3. Obviously, Zeppelin's arrival on the scene blew everybody away. That sound, their style, the loudness, it was all new and groundbreaking. We have Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young with Deja Vu, a monster album, the biggest touring band in the world in 1970, and a classic album. Then we have Tea for the Tillman by Cat Stevens, another singer-songwriter. The singer-songwriter period in the 70s was extremely strong. As we'll see here, quite a lot of entries coming up. Abraxas by Santana, and Sex Machine by James Brown. We also have Layla, the Layla album by Derek and the Dominos, Neil Young After the Gold Rush, Van Morrison Moondance, Elton John Tumbleweed Connection, and Free Fire and Water. Then we'll do 5 more here. Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, a jazz fusion album, which was getting very big at the time. American Beauty by the Grateful Dead. Simon & Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Emerson, Lake & Palmer's first album, self-titled. And Benefit by Jethro Tull. All 15 of these albums I would consider to be on the cutting edge of pop and rock music at the time. And the Beatle albums that were released in 70, I think measure up pretty well against those. Let's look at 1971. Now, the Beatles had 3 albums out, the Solo Beatles. Ringo is without an album. John Lennon has Imagine. Paul McCartney, Ram. And George Harrison, Concert for Bangladesh. Imagine, I would say, is a slight step down album-wise from Plastic Ono Band, but the song Imagine kept Lennon pretty much on the cutting edge, I think. And I think this is the last moment he ever was on any cutting edge of any sort, musically, was the song Imagine. Paul McCartney's Ram, a much heralded album now, not so in the day, but I think it's fair to say that his style of do-it-yourself recording was an inspiration to other artists, and this album is pretty solid. I would call this a cutting-edge record. And finally, George Harrison's Concert for Bangladesh. Although it's a live album, I think the humanitarian angle of this was the first of its kind, having a bunch of friends get together. He seemed to like to do that, get his buddies together. They put on this great concert for a very good cause. So this is the period where I would say the Beatles fell off the cutting edge, never to return again. And this is about, if the Beatles were to have continued, this is as far as they could have gone, remaining at that high level, artistically, commercially, and critically. Let's see what the competition was turning out. Okay, 1971, we've got Hunky Dory by David Bowie. Great album. Bowie was, I thought he was a game changer for that decade. I don't think the Beatles were doing anything like what he was doing. Joni Mitchell, Blue. Who's Next by The Who. Zeppelin 4. Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. Sticky Fingers by The Stones. Carole King, Tapestry. Electric Warrior by T-Rex. Isaac Hayes, Shaft. Just As I Am by Bill Withers. Maggot Brain by Funkadelic. Fragile by Yes. There's a Ride Going On by Sly and the Family Stone. Aqualung by Jethro Tull. And finally, Every Picture Tells a Story by Rod Stewart. Now, clearly those albums, we know what a great year 1971 is. And the Beatles, the solo Beatles are, I don't think they're quite keeping up with the 15 I just listed. These are the absolute cutting edge in rock and pop, and you're going to see the drop-off extremely drastic here in 1972. So where are the Beatles in 1972? Well, we got 2 albums. George and Ringo bowed out this year. We have Lennon doing the joint album with his wife called Sometime in New York City, and McCartney decides to form a band and call it Wings. Both of these albums are low points in each respective career, and they really had a hard... McCartney did recover. Lennon had a much harder time recovering from Sometime in New York City. Let's look at the competition in 72 up against our 2 Beatle offerings. We have the Eagles' first album, the advent of 70s California rock. Steely Dan, Can't Buy a Thrill. Thick as a Brick, Jethro Tull. David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Lou Reed, Transformer. Harvest by Neil Young. Honky Chateau, Elton John. Eat a Peach by the Allman Brothers. Exile on Main Street by the Stones. Al Green, I'm Still in Love with You. Deep Purple, Machine Head. Todd Rundgren, Something Anything. Stevie Wonder, Talking Book. Big Star, self-titled album. And Pink Moon by Nick Drake. So those 15 albums kick the ass of those other 2 solo Beatle albums. The chasm between the quality is huge. The solo Beatles collectively never regained that cutting edge ground. So let's have a look at the next year for our solo Beatles. Okay, 1973 we have 4 albums, one by each ex-Beatle. Mind Games by John Lennon. Considered an average album by just about everybody, not his best. Ditto, Red Rose Speedway with McCartney, though he does have the big #1 with My Love. The rest of the album, questionable. It was supposed to be a double album, but the record company said, go back to the drawing board. We have George Harrison's Living in the Material World. He pulled off a #1 song on that album, Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, which is essentially son of My Sweet Lord. And it's hard to get a #1, so I give him credit for that, but it's just a pop song. I don't think it's important. The rest of the album is a bit preachy. This is where he gets a little bit, the spiritual side of his recording got to be a little bit off-putting to some fans. And finally, perhaps the highlight of those four is the Ringo album. Just a great pop album. And the only time Ringo really will achieve such heights in his entire career, his entire recording career. So let's have a look at the competition in 1973. Start off with a biggie, Dark Side of the Moon. We go to Mahavishnu Orchestra, their debut album. Brain Salad Surgery, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Iggy and the Stooges, Raw Power Live. Intervisions by Stevie Wonder. Houses of the Holy by Led Zeppelin. Jackson Browne's For Every Man. Closing Time by Tom Waits. Grateful Dead in the Wake of the Flood. Genesis Selling England by the Pound. The final five, we have Piano Man by Billy Joel. Quadrophenia by The Who. Bob Marley and the Wailers, Catch a Fire. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. And Let's Get It On by Marvin Gaye. So we see the 70s shaping into the Elton Johns and the Steely Dans and the Led Zeppelins are really hitting their stride, putting out really high quality stuff. They're the leaders in the industry. Let's go back to the Beatles, 1974. We've got four albums again. We've got Walls and Bridges by John Lennon, an improvement over Mind Games, but still not what you would call cutting edge recording. Band on the Run, actually released very late 73, I put in 1974. This album is an incredibly good album. McCartney, as far as pop music goes, I would say, is this a cutting edge record? Well, perhaps, some may say so. But where McCartney was really hitting his stride here was in the pop genre. The songs like Band on the Run and that medley stuff he was doing had been done before by his former group. The pop song was perfected really in the 60s. So to do another couple of great pop songs, which this album has, I wouldn't necessarily say that's cutting edge. We'll look at the cutting edge pop people coming up here shortly. Dark Horse by George Harrison, we see the decline of his material here big time with this album. And Ringo's Goodnight Vienna, which is basically a Ringo light. And now the competition. 1974, we have Queen 2, Court and Spark by Joni Mitchell, Kraftwerk Autobahn, Supertramp Crime of the Century, Genesis The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Frank Zappa Apostrophe, Dolly Parton Jolene, and Jackson Browne Late for the Sky, Radio City by Big Star, Bad Company's first album, Roxy Music, Diamond Dogs by Bowie, El Dorado by Electric Light Orchestra, The Way We Were by Barbra Streisand, and Pretzel Logic by Steely Dan. So I would say the Steely Dan material, Joni Mitchell, Queen, those Supertramp, those are the bands that had, in my opinion, the more cutting edge pop music at the time, as opposed to Paul McCartney's Band on the Run. Now we go to 1975. Lennon releases his last album in a while. This is the rock and roll cover album. The man had given up by this point, apparently. Venus and Mars, which is the ugly stepchild of Band on the Run, although he's got a good band together for this album. More is to come on that. George Harrison continues his slide with Extra Texture. Meanwhile, we have albums like their contemporary Bob Dylan coming out with Blood on the Tracks, Patti Smith Horses, Bruce Springsteen Born to Run, Physical Graffiti by Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac self-titled album, the first album with Dick Buckingham and Nicks. We've got Earth, Wind and Fire, That's the Way of the World, Aerosmith Toys in the Attic, Queen A Night at the Opera, Jeff Beck Blow by Blow, Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. Great follow-up to the masterpiece. Bongo Fury by Zappa and Beefheart, Fly By Night by Rush, Equinox by Styx, ABBA's first album, and Still Crazy After All These Years by Paul Simon as the top cutting-edge albums of 1975. 1976, we have three albums. We've got Wings at the Speed of Sound by Paul McCartney. We have 33 1/3 by George Harrison, which is a big improvement over his prior two albums. I would say Wings at the Speed of Sound was McCartney really settling into the pop world in a big way. No more Ram type of stuff. It's all very slick. And Ringo's Rotogravure, which was, what can you say about it? Not very mentionable. A couple of minor hits, but I consider Ringo Starr a bit more of a novelty entertainer at this point. Keep in mind that in the 1970s was a huge time for the novelty song. I mean, from like 72 to 76, you had songs like My Ding-a-Ling, Convoy, The Streak, Disco Duck. You know, you had all these songs like Ooka Chaka, Ooka Chaka, and Ringo Starr's music fit into that period very well because he was a little bit goofy. He was not to be taken too seriously is what I'm saying. And I think that's why he worked during a part of the 70s. That would not last. So let's look at 1976. Let's see what's going on here. We have Boston's first album, monster album. Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder. Joni Mitchell, Hejira. Frampton Comes Alive. The Royal Scam by Steely Dan. Hotel California, The Eagles. Bright-Sized Life by Pat Metheny. The Ramones' first album. Boz Scaggs, Silk Torpedo. And Heart Dreamboat Annie. AC/DC, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers' first album. Tom Waits' Small Change. Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. Night Moves. And Desire by Bob Dylan. All pretty solid stuff. Okay, we're in 1977 now, and as we get to the end of the 70s, we see the Beatles solo stuff turning into a new genre almost. I'll explain that in a moment. So 77, McCartney does Wings Over America, the triple live album, and this was McCartney's triumphant return to the States. Live albums were all the rage during the mid-70s. And he saw no reason not to join in. Very solid. It's more of an event, I think, not so much the album. Ringo IV, that album is one of his worst. I would say that's an embarrassing album. I have a hard time getting through it. I tried recently just to do this video, and it was a struggle. Let's see the competition in 1977. Things are starting to get really different compared to the ex-Beatles. We have The Clash, Elvis Costello, The Sex Pistols, Cheap Trick, Chic, Fleetwood Mac Rumors, Asia by Steely Dan, Point of No Return by Kansas, Animals, Pink Floyd, Peter Gabriel, Running on Empty by Jackson Browne, Rush, A Farewell to Kings, The Stranger by Billy Joel, Talking Heads 77, and Saturday Night Fever by the Bee Gees. That was a various artists album. But I think disco was actually somewhat of an important movement in the 70s. I know it's a bit of a joke, but it was way more than a fad. And there was a time when disco music was actually very well written and well produced. It did get homogenized like most everything else does. Okay, so let's move along here quickly. We've got London Town and Bad Boy. So London Town, McCartney, we see him here settling into a softer rock style. Still a pretty solid album. He ends up doing a disco album. Here we see Ringo Starr firmly as a follower, never had really been a leader, and this kind of clinches that. And John Lennon, still nothing from Lennon. He's busy living a blissful life in the Dakota, changing diapers, baking bread, whilst Yoko Ono, in between tarot card readings, is building up the great vast empire from her home office. Let's see what the competition is kicking out here in 1978. We're going to go through these a little more quickly here. You're getting the idea. So 78, we've got Van Halen's first album, the first album by The Police, Cars' first album, Blondie's, I think this is their third album, Parallel Lines, Jerry Rafferty, City to City, and Prince's first album. So I'm just going to stop with those there. I'm going to jump back over to the Beatles solo stuff. You can see the changes in the industry and how the Beatles were not only falling behind, but falling behind in a way where they started to imitate the current trends. And we see that in 1979 to some degree with Paul McCartney with Back to the Egg. Pretty solid album, but here he's trying to do punk on a couple of tracks. And when McCartney tries to imitate, it's usually a bit cringy. And in this case, I don't know why he bothered, quite frankly. Two of the weaker tracks on the album. George Harrison's self-titled album from 1979. Excellent album. However, Harrison has now dipped into complete 100% adult contemporary music. He no longer rocks. Moving into 1980, Mr. Lennon is back with his wife with Double Fantasy. This album, which was nice at the time, I was happy that it came out and was just starting to enjoy it when what happened happened. However, Lennon's material on that album is not, it's a little bit sappy, it's overly sentimental in some places. A guy that has lost his edge incredibly. He's just watching the wheels now, just had to let it go. And then we got McCartney too. He's back solo with an album that's okay, had a #1 song on it, but really, I think McCartney had to reinvent himself a bit here now that he got rid of his band. 1981, the albums after Lennon was killed. We have Paul McCartney, Tug of War, and that has the very famous song, Ebony and Ivory, which at the time seemed kind of quaint. Now it just seems a bit silly. And then we have Harrison's next album, which is Somewhere in England, which had the big John Lennon tribute on it. Without that song, that album is really very weak. And Ringo's album, Stop and Smell the Roses, has got a couple good songs on it, and George Harrison chips in there. And these are the early 80s, and these guys are just entering their 40s, and this is the time period when you're not making hit songs for young guys. I mean, rock music is a young man's game, and these guys are no longer young men. So I think it's fairly easy to see the drop-off of the Solo Beatles starting in 1972. Never really regained the ground of that cutting-edge artist ever again. In the 80s, this next era, 83 to 94, obviously they're releasing less material. They're getting older. We have a couple missteps here, of course. Poor Ringo couldn't even get a record contract. His first album of this period, which was called Old Wave, was not even released in the UK or the US. Nobody was interested. Harrison's Gone Troppo. I'm surprised that album was even allowed to be released. I thought that's an extremely weak album. And Pipes of Peace by McCartney, this is the period where he started recording with the top stars of the day, Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder. He couldn't really do it himself anymore. He had to bring on some help. 84, we've got one more blip of Lennon, The Milk and Honey. People thought that Yoko was milking it. That's got a couple pleasant tracks on it, but a mere shadow of what the man once was. Meanwhile, McCartney is doing Give My Regards to Broad Street, one of the bigger embarrassments of his career. He should never, film is not his medium, and this finally convinced him, I believe, after several mishaps. 1985, nothing. 86, we have Press to Play by McCartney. McCartney's still struggling here to find his mojo. But Harrison took a few years off, which was probably a good idea, and was able to come up with a pretty solid album called Cloud 9, which shows you what a few years off can do to gather your best material. 88, we have the Russian album and Harrison's Traveling Wilburys, still gathering his buddies together. That seems to be his comfort zone. In this case, it works. 89, we have McCartney's Flowers in the Dirt. This is where McCartney starts to go to the nostalgia route in his career, which was a good move. I think he struggled in the 80s. Time was passing him by, the industry was passing him by, and he decided, well, he brought out the Hofner bass guitar and started to tour again. So that was a big change in his career, and it was more nostalgic. 1990, we have another Wilburys album. Then we go up to 92, Time Takes Time. That's Ringo's first album in a decade. And a nice album, a pleasant album. Too bad that didn't come out in 1978 when he really could have used it. And Off the Ground in 93. So we've got, in this particular 12-year span, in what I call the chart decline era, we've got 2 top 10 albums collectively and 4 top 10 singles. Now compare that with the golden era, where we have 23 top 10 albums and 36 top 10 singles. So the Beatles were clearly aging out of pop music, and sometimes gracefully, sometimes not so much. And finally, let's take a brief glimpse at this final period, the Twilight Era, which is the last 26 years of the Beatles solo era. This is dominated by McCartney, who's got 9 studio albums during this time under his name. Varying quality. The first one in 97, Flaming Pie, I think most consider that his best in this time frame. The other albums that follow, he always seems to have some good material on it, these later albums, this is not really my style. I don't care to listen to this kind of stuff. But McCartney's got a pretty solid niche fan base that do buy these. And I think they find them worthwhile. He can still write songs. George Harrison had one album in this time frame. Obviously, we know why. And Brainwashed, I thought was an excellent album. That's one album I listened to start to finish quite a lot. However, when I listen to it now, it sounds very dated to me. I don't listen to it much anymore. And you know, that production of Jeff Lynne, I mean, it just doesn't reach out and grab you. It just has no balls to it, you know. And then let's look at Ringo here. Now, I find this very strange. Ringo with 10 albums in the same time period, 10 studio albums, that doesn't count the recent EPs, and he outproduced McCartney during this period. Now, I have never seen 10 albums in a row that were more banal, more irrelevant, and meaningless than these 10 Ringo albums. And I know that some of you maybe really like these albums. I'm not making fun of you. I like crazy stuff too that a lot of people hate. But this to me represents what the music industry has become, which is essentially an exercise in putting out product and marketing to niches. And I mean, 10 albums outdoing McCartney. I mean, only an ex-Beatle could get away with this. And I can't think of any other artist that has anywhere near this type of amount of music in their 60s through their 80s and able to sell it. I guess you guys must like it. I can't listen to this stuff. I've listened to a little bit of it. And one thing I've noticed in his last couple of releases, those EPs, he had this song called Change the World. I'm sure some of you heard of some of it. And I have never heard Ringo Starr sound so good. Why the hell is that? Because he's auto-tuned beyond belief. That's why. What is it we're listening to here? It ain't Ringo, guys. It's computers. And I mean, at some point you got to draw the line. And I basically draw the line on this Twilight Years era. I don't listen to much of it because why would I? I don't listen to new music of old men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's just not what I listen to. I think starting in 72, the Beatles solo stuff is nowhere near what was on the cutting edge in rock music. So that's my overview of the Beatles' solo careers. I know I'm a little bit harsh on the Beatles' solo careers, more harsh than most people you see here on YouTube. But again, I think there needs to be some perspective. I don't expect everybody to agree with me. Some of this is personal taste. But I thought that by comparing them to their contemporaries in the 70s in particular, really gives some perspective as to the quality of the solo material and where they really stand in the echelon of that era of music. A lot of good stuff during the 70s, but for me personally, I usually just make playlists and play the stuff I like best. I don't listen to their albums all the way through much, just because I don't think it's good enough. And my time is valuable, and yours is too, so I hope you stick around for my upcoming Beatles solo reviews. I've got a couple coming, and just wanted to give you this to prepare you for what might be a little bit more of a critical look at some of their solo stuff, and we'll be doing that right here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Let's change the world. A day